live now. Okay, good morning. Good morning to everybody who is watching us now on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, listening to us in Clubhouse. It's a pleasure to have you with us on this beautiful morning here in Tokyo and maybe in Atami as well. So it is.
It's
Yeah.
beautiful, but the kosa is pretty hidoi. The blowing over from China. Like I want to open my windows, but it's not good today. So, but yeah,
Well,
it's warm. It's really
it
warm.
is, yes. It's
Yeah,
sunny, it's warm, it's very, the sky is very clear here. And
yeah,
yes, I can see a kind of yellowish layer here in
yeah,
Tokyo as well. I believe this is because of the yellow dust-like sand coming from the west. Well, we know which country and where. But
yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
so I hope that it clears up later this afternoon so that everybody can breathe a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks a lot again for joining us. We have the pleasure of welcoming Michael or Mick McCoy today. So I know that many of you who are based in Tokyo already know Mick because he's a very active member of the Tokyo community, foreign community, and also I believe Japanese community as well. And we are going to talk about team breakthroughs across cultures today. I'm looking forward to actually hearing what Mick has to tell us, and we're going to have a pleasant conversation, I believe, this morning. But before that, I just want to say thank you to our first sponsor. As you already know, our first sponsor is Kanchu. Ooh, this is Houze, right? So just give me a second. Now, what is this? Okay. Yes,
Here
here
we
we go.
go.
Yes, it seems that technology sometimes
Yay!
it's not so easy to navigate. But yes, Kanchu, as you already know them, you can find them online as kanachu.com. You can connect with James Howell at james@kanachu.com. If you have any projects in the fields of buying and selling real estate in Yokohama, real estate advancement and property management as well. We have been working with James for a while. We have known him for longer than that. And we are really very happy and proud that James and Kanacho decided to allow us to promote them on this podcast here. So do not hesitate. James speaks Japanese as well. His colleagues are Japanese, but he can hear you out in English and talk with you in English about your project and also your needs. So once again, back to our guest, Mick. Good morning, and thank you very much for agreeing to be on the podcast with us this morning.
Good morning, Maya and Tim, and thank you very much for having me. It's a delight to
We're
be with you
honored.
again.
Yeah.
Yeah, the pleasure is ours. And it's always nice to know that eventually we got you because we have been talking about this for maybe over 2 years now.
I
And
think I think I had hair when we first discussed it. Yeah.
right,
Mm.
yes, yes. No, but really, thank you so very much for
Mm.
coming to the podcast. And well, let's go into the topic. I know that many people are willing to hear what you're going to tell us about. But before that, could you please let us know a little bit about your Japan story? So,
Okay.
what is
Mm.
it?
Mm. So as a kid, I was always very interested in languages, um, and I guess this got me into the whole curiosity about cultures. So it really started when I was in elementary school and started teaching myself French from the label on the sauce bottle at the dinner table. Yeah. So it was a sort of like a tonkatsu sauce. So it was this English sauce called HP sauce, and it had a bilingual label. So it was also written in French, and so I remember teaching myself a little bit of French, and
Oh,
then in the last year of elementary school, got the opportunity to start learning French itself,
Wow.
and that was dipping my toes into language, and I guess I became quite Francophile, going into my teens as a result of
Mhm.
the French. However, fast forward to the next year, and I find myself traveling a little bit further within Belfast. And as you both know, I grew up in Belfast during a particularly challenging time for society there. We had political violence, which made our city quite infamous, I guess,
Mhm.
around the world. And this really, really got me interested in people's unmet needs, whether those unmet needs were real or imagined. And whether they're real or imagined, I think we really need to treat them as equally valid.
Right.
Because
Because the perception is the reality in a sense.
perception is the reality. Yeah.
Yeah.
If we try to make light of perceptions, we are being disingenuous, I think. Yeah. So
And
looking for,
you're inviting resistance too.
you're inviting, very much inviting resistance.
You push
Yeah.
people in a box
Yeah.
almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So just to continue, we had this thing around unmet needs. I was growing up in a less dangerous environment, let's say,
Mhm.
for want of a better word. In my part of Belfast, it was what we called a mixed community. So you had people of Irish identity and British identity living as neighbors, with some overspill from the rest of the city in terms of attitudes. We were so as has often been stated regarding the conflict there. The religion was shorthand for conflict. So Catholics were seen as Irish identity, Protestants were seen as British identity, and very rigidly so. And that wasn't exactly the case. There was quite a lot of overlap, which itself was a lesson in being wary of stereotypes. And that sunk in at a young age. So we've
Yeah.
got these unmet needs, and not actually challenging our perceptions, our own perceptions, and being wary about challenging other people's perceptions, to Tim's point of
Yeah.
you know eliciting resistance, for example. So they must have filtered in there somewhere and remained in my head. The languages. So in the first year of I guess in Japan you say junior high school, I found myself traveling across the city to an inner city part of Belfast, which was let's say a little bit rougher and tougher than where I had grown up. Yeah, and exposed to all these kids, who many of whom had really been a lot more exposed than I had been to the interface of essentially two tribes clashing, and uh, more often than not violently so. It's also where I started learning other languages. Irish Gaelic, which Tim and I were exchanging a little earlier, as well as continuing with the French. The next year saw me adding Latin
Oh, right. Okay.
was
That's tough.
well, yeah.
Yeah.
If anyone has
It
studied
was it
Latin,
not required? Like in Catholic schools in Chicago, Latin was almost a requirement, at least until about my age got there.
that's a great question. So at the end of the first year in junior high school, we were given a choice.
All right. Yeah.
Given a
Wow.
choice. So they said, you've got a choice of 4 languages. Choose which ones you want to take. And so my first choice was German. Second choice was Spanish. Third choice was Italian. And last choice was Latin. And
Yeah.
yeah. So at the end of the year, they said, McCoy, you're clever.
Okay.
That's scary,
Obviously
right?
deluded. But I was quite introverted. Perhaps they wanted me to become a priest or something like that. Anyway, they said, you're doing Latin. And I
Oh,
thought, oh, thanks very much.
Thanks
Yeah,
for letting me choose. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, indeed, indeed. Those unmet needs
all right. Yeah.
surfaced quite brutally. And so I endured several years of Latin. But the Latin was very, very useful in terms of building up that romantic language element, and subsequently helped me to um, uh, get other notches on my belt in terms of qualification in Spanish. In When I went into high school, for example, and being able to communicate with people in the likes of Brazil or Portugal. I haven't been to Romania, but I imagine I'd get by there too.
Yeah. I'm sure you would. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, anyway, so this really, I guess, worked as a foundation and a fascination with the use of language as a vehicle to better, I guess, um, satisfy our curiosity about other cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yeah.
I'd grown up seeing, that there was some perceived difference between people in my neighborhood, for
Mm-hmm.
example, and this perceived difference was very, very different. If you went further into the city, a couple of kilometers, um, and yet these people were all watching the same TV shows, laughing at the same comedians,
Yeah.
buying the same pop records, wearing the same fashions, supporting the same English Premier League football teams, etc., etc.,
Yeah.
etc. Yeah, and you
How
know,
old were you when you became aware of this? You articulated this to yourself, because that's very
I
profound. What
guess
you're saying.
1972,
Wow.
um, and I've got photos here of me, very very young at the time, but at my sister's wedding.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a photo of my sister and my brother-in-law, and they've been married, still madly in love with each other. Both of them ecstatic on their wedding day. Not many people were sharing that ecstasy, because 2 or 3 weeks earlier, at a civil rights march in a place called Derry, depending on the map you look at, it might be called Londonderry. Um, 13 people, I think it was, had been shot dead um, by the British Army.
Mm.
Um, and for the subsequent 2-3 decades or so, after that, the official record was that these people who had been shot dead were terrorists.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
And it's a very convenient label.
Oh, yeah.
And it was only at the time of David Cameron's government in the UK. So what's that? The late 90s. That I think it's the late 90s, even into the 2000s. That finally there was an inquiry. The first inquiry actually was a whitewash. There was an official inquiry, and one of the top judges in the UK decided that yes, these were all terrorists, etc., etc. Anyway, not to dive too deeply into that, but I thought, well, why is my sister and her, Shane, as I knew him, why Maura and Shane, why are they smiling and few other people seem to be as happy as they are? And so that was really
Crystallized it.
Yeah, crystallizing the importance of context and understanding context.
Yeah. Oh wow, that's amazing at such a young age. I mean, my often says the dots connect backwards. Like, so as I've gotten older and I look back, I gain these kinds of awarenesses. But I wish I had the awareness back then when it was happening in the moment. So I just thought, but that's amazing.
Yeah.
How your background fed into your life outlook. And I know you're going to connect it to Japan because
indeed,
that's your next, right?
Precisely, yeah. So just jumping forward again to that first year that I was at junior high school, one of my classmates asked me, "What are Protestants like?" I thought, what? What kind of question is that? What are Protestants like? And we'd grown up in a city where at the time, I think Protestants were still a majority, both in terms of population and politically. And I said, why? I've never met one.
Right.
Okay, so fast forward, late teens. I was still very interested in languages, continued with Irish, which was a language very close to my heart, the language I was best at the time. I've forgotten most of it these days. And the French I took up until pre-university stage. And several years after that, my curiosity about languages, and especially the curiosity about Japan, which had really been created by, as you know, right throughout the world, the miniaturization and reliability of so many products that we saw. Yeah.
And it used to not be that way. In the 60s, if it was made in Japan, was bad.
Yeah.
And it was, when you buy these toys,
you would peel the sticker off, the made in Japan sticker, you would peel that off. But,
right.
Yeah.
A decade later,
and then there came this point where you polished the sticker.
Yeah, right.
Or put sellotape over it. Yeah.
Oh.
And anyway, so long story short, there, I found myself, met somebody cuter looking than myself, and we decided to go backpacking through Asia, and she was from Tokyo, and I guess in terms of this journey, it was my first real culture shock. Now people talk about culture shock coming to Japan, but the culture shock for me was actually being in India. First time outside Europe, suddenly there are millions and millions and millions of people everywhere. Everywhere.
Yeah.
All around you, millions of people. And, in Europe, Maya and Tim in North America too. It's not so heavily populated. You know, you wouldn't find yourself in a random crowd of 1 million people.
Right.
But this created a sensory overload, I guess, for me. And I very much questioned, what am I doing here? And probably had a bit of a nervous breakdown for the first 2 days. I'm thinking, what am I doing? What am I doing here? How can I escape?
Yeah, you were freaking out in today's
I was
world.
freaking out. Yeah. And it wasn't because, you know, people didn't look like me.
Right.
You know, they're people just like me. In different circumstances, wearing different clothes. It was just, there were so many of them. Yeah. And to my introverted self, this was also an issue, I guess. So the night, our second night that we were in Delhi, I heard the sound of a steam train in a local railway yard.
Just like the movies.
Right, yes.
I'd never heard that sound before.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, that's really cool. That's really romantic and evocative and everything. And you know how they say to keep people with Alzheimer's happy?
I don't know that.
Ensure that they go to sleep happy. So tell them a joke, or, you know, compliment
music that they like, or
tell them a nice story, something. Yeah. Just like that. This obviously, you know, went into whatever part of my head it was, or my heart, and processed itself overnight. So the next morning, I jumped out of bed and said, "Give me India! Give me more India! I can't get enough India!" And I'd fallen in love with the country. Yeah, and had an absolute ball. Fast forward, we're a little bit of an adventure. We overlanded up into Kathmandu, Nepal, then through Tibet, and through northwest China proper, and across to Beijing. I had somewhere along the line caught, do you catch it? Caught gastroenteritis, I think, from some poor hygiene somewhere. I know exactly what it was. Actually, that detail's not so important. And spent 3 days on a train traveling across northern China.
Oh, wow.
Due to get into Beijing on Christmas Eve, my first Christmas away from home. And with gastroenteritis, you know, your life is escaping from every orifice, essentially. And so I arrived in Beijing Christmas Eve, and at the time you couldn't actually use the local currency. You had to have foreign exchange certificates as a foreigner, yeah, and pay. So there were 3 pricing levels at the time. So the locals paid a certain price in renminbi, the government currency. Overseas Chinese paid another price, and then finally overseas non-Chinese paid another price.
Wow.
But
so which category were you in?
No. I think I was overseas non-Chinese. I tried to disguise the fact, but failed miserably. Anyway, so thankfully, the person I was traveling with went to the Friendship Store, which was a place for the diplomatic community in Beijing at the time, where she was able to find some Guinness.
Oh, okay. On
Yeah,
the other side of the globe.
on the other side of the
Wow.
globe. Yes.
Mhm.
Oh,
Yes.
wow.
So Guinness is a little bit like the Coca-Cola of beers. You'll see it everywhere.
Yeah.
And so she brought me this Guinness, and it must have been the placebo effect. You're
Yeah.
Ireland. It's
Mm.
it has lots of iron in it. I had
Yeah.
lost a lot of liquid.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is a recommendation, kids.
Yeah, you're right.
Um,
Guinness saved
when
your
you're
life.
feeling run down, you've seen the old ads.
Yeah.
Guinness is good for you. Well, the iron in Guinness really, really helped.
Rejuvenated.
Got me well again. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay, kids. I don't think we have any
Yes,
kids listening,
exactly.
so we're probably pretty
Yeah.
safe today.
So anyway, the next 10 days saw us going down towards Hong Kong and spending a few nights in Hong Kong, where I think one night we actually wanted a little bit of an adventure and slept on the beach. Now, this was January for most people, January for us as well, but we'd been up in the north of China where it had actually been quite cold.
Mhm.
And when it came to being in Hong Kong, we were in shorts and t-shirts, and we felt warm enough to sleep on the beach. And people, of course, were looking at us like we were crazy. And once again, it's the perceptions. Yeah, what's the context, and how does that environment shape your perceptions?
Yeah. Right.
So coming to Japan was actually quite a soft landing for me.
You had
Um,
already been, yeah,
yeah,
you were prepped.
yeah.
You-
I'd experienced the culture shock,
yeah.
um, and then I'd seen Hong Kong, which at the time was there were, for example, British policemen and even British Army Land Rovers. I saw one of those, and there was a lot of familiar things, which coming from the People's Republic at the time, that was, oh, okay. It was almost like going into a decompression chamber,
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah,
coming from culturally and
Right, right.
in terms of, I guess what you've been exposed to before, and it was a very comfortable stepping stone then into Japan. Yeah. And of course, the thing about Japan was the language is very different. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
But you have had, I guess, exposure to something which is a very, very different paradigm to your own.
yeah.
And that was a very useful useful bridge, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
And really spoke to these, I guess, the steps between one particular culture and another. Yeah. Or if you're trying to bridge anything, if you try to, have just a bridge with no stays in the middle, then it might not be so strong. And
Right, right.
that reinforced that. Now that I
You were
try to make sense of it.
acclimated. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh,
So we've got all these different factors, really, subliminally, unconsciously, um, creating new, what I discovered subsequently were synapses, and really making sense of things for me. Yeah.
So what year did you get to Japan?
1987.
87. That's okay. I was leaving, so
Okay.
you were replacing me. Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. All right. Uh-huh.
Great.
We're brothers from a different mother. That's
Yes,
great.
indeed. Indeed. Yeah.
Okay, so before we continue, then please allow me to, say thank you to our other sponsor today, and that is Houze, or they are also known, yes, as Houze Inc. You can find them online at www.houze.co.jp or contact them via webmaster at houze.co.jp. They work in Yokohama. The company is based in Yokohama and they work in the fields of custom home design and construction. They also do commercial building construction. If you have any such projects in mind, do not hesitate to reach out to them. You can talk with them either in English or in Japanese because our very good friend Hana Urushizawa Howell is there as well, and she can talk with you in any of these two languages. So the language barrier is not an issue there. Please feel free to reach out to them and work with them. We have worked with Hannah for quite a while now, as well as with James. So we know that we can recommend them with open hearts. And now back to our conversation. So we are in Japan now,
Mm.
Mick. So you have arrived in Japan, and
Right.
just
Yeah.
in the year when Tim left. But now
Uh-huh.
let's see what happened when you came here.
Right. Okay. So one of the first things I did was enrolled in a Japanese school
Mhm.
because of the fascination with a language which was outside of the European paradigm
Yeah.
as a way of better understanding a country that had so many centuries of sakoku,
Yeah.
of being closed off to
Isolated.
the
Yeah.
rest of the world, essentially.
Yeah.
Um, and that was quite fascinating. I also had exposure to corporate Japan, and even though it's not so far from where I live at the moment, I very rarely went to Roppongi.
Oh, right, yeah.
And as a consequence, I didn't get into that sort of, what is it, pity party, for want of a better word.
Well, you
That-
didn't get a negative influence, or if I can say
So,
that.
yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Just a
yeah,
quick
yeah.
question because
Or if there was a negative influence, it was purely of my own making.
yeah,
Right.
no, that's what I was gonna say because like I went to Roppongi a few times when I first came. I was in the Navy and we'd
Yeah,
go
yeah,
for a night and come back.
yeah.
But
It's mandatory, isn't it? Yeah,
it's almost mandatory.
yeah.
But are you implying that there is a negative vibe there amongst the Gaikokujin who are like, you know, bad mouthing Japan or feeling sorry for themselves because they're victims in Japan or what is that? I never felt that, but it might have been there.
Occasionally, and this really depends on the circles that people move in, but
Yeah.
occasionally when coaching expat executives,
Mhm.
uh, uh, I've heard some stereotypes,
Gotcha. Yeah, yes, yes. I agree with you. I agree with
Yeah.
you.
and I
I
said,
agree.
"Okay, so where did you hear this?" Oh, in such and such a pub.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
Okay. Okay.
we've got a group,
Okay.
and
Okay.
we're
Yeah.
all from, we're all good friends. People from all
mhm.
sorts of countries, all sorts of countries being the Anglosphere, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and so this is where perhaps a lot of the stereotypes are tend to be exacerbated or
Okay.
perpetuated.
Just a
Yeah.
quick point.
Yep.
We had the same thing on base where I
Yeah.
was at. Like the
Yeah.
first 2.5 years, everybody's giving me these negative messages about
Yeah. Yeah.
Japan,
Yeah.
and they never left the base, so they didn't know,
Yeah.
but they had these stereotypes.
Right.
I was defiant, and me and my buddy, we went off base and we
Yeah,
mingled and we made friends right. They told us we couldn't make friends.
yeah,
We made friends
yeah,
right
yeah,
away.
yeah,
We had a
Yeah.
blast. So you're
Yeah.
right. I saw that gap, right? Yeah.
yeah.
It's interesting
And
because, yeah, when I came to Japan, and I was afraid of going to Roppongi actually. So it was that, anticipation of just seeing or hearing something that I didn't want to hear. And yeah, I actually didn't know Roppongi until very recently. And
wow,
even nowadays, I don't go there that often, maybe once in 2 months or 3 months. And it's just
Yeah.
for, a very brief period
yeah,
of time.
But
yeah,
just a quick historical perspective. When I was
yeah.
here, Roppongi was considered upper class, and then by the time I came back, it was considered like really a kind of a negative, bad place to go. So
Yeah,
its image changed over time.
yeah,
I've
yeah.
noticed.
Well, it was called the Pong at one stage. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Oh, I didn't
I
know
never
that.
heard that one, but
The
Yeah, I
smell.
never
Yeah,
did. So we
yeah.
have a comment from Joseph Murphy saying, but Roppongi is cool, right? So, yeah.
cool,
Yes, of
like
course it's cool.
cool in
And
quotes.
I occasionally go there for fish and chips.
Hmm.
I have no connection to the Hobgoblin, apart from a Hobgoblin pub being my local for many years in
Yeah.
London.
Oh,
But
okay.
if anybody wants authentic fish and chips and huge portions, um,
Okay,
yeah,
good to
go
know.
there. I'm not getting paid by the Hobgoblin.
Okay.
If they
Unfortunately.
if they want to supply me some fish and chips, well, that's beside the point.
Yes. Okay, now let
But,
me let me read
yeah,
a question
Yeah,
yeah.
from
that's a great
Joseph.
question. Thank you, Joseph.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, do you see some parallels between the two island nations, Japan and Ireland?
That's an excellent question. Um, I hear the same thing between Japan and Britain, for
Hmm.
example.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I've
between
heard that too. Yeah, yeah.
Japan and Ireland, of course, being a much smaller country, much smaller population.
Hmm.
Um, there is a great affinity within Japan for Irish culture. If we look, what was it? The week before last,
Yeah.
we had the St. Patrick's Day festival,
Yeah.
and this is a day when Omotesando is bedecked with Irish flags
I love it.
beside the Hinomaru, of course. Um, and it's only Ireland that gets to do this, and that speaks to a
It's
soft power,
oh yeah. Oh right, right,
a soft
right.
power, diplomatically,
Hmm.
that is probably not unique to Ireland, but I think thanks to the Irish diaspora, and maybe we can thank our British cousins for the
Yeah.
diaspora. Um, thanks to the Irish diaspora, um, this soft power has spread throughout the world.
Yeah.
Um,
So that's one thing in common. You got the soft power. I
yep,
think
yep,
storytelling cultures.
yep,
And when I was in college, I studied black humor. I was studying rakugo,
yep,
but and I was focused on like death related, like
Hmm.
funerals or whatever, right?
yep.
And as I started getting into rakugo,
Mm,
I realized, and again, this is secondhand Irish culture. This is Irish
yeah,
American
yeah,
culture.
yeah, yeah,
My dad was so into black humor. He was so
yeah,
into like he had so many Irish funeral jokes that were hilarious. And I saw this kind of similarity in that sense of humor.
yeah.
There was a lot of overlap with that
Mhm.
kind of that dark humor,
Yeah,
certainly
yeah.
as it's represented in
Mm,
Rakugo, right? Um,
excellent. Yeah.
would you say the Irish are a little bit more, I'm sure they are, collectivist than say Americans who are all over the map?
Yeah, yeah. I would say definitely less individualistic.
Right.
Um, uh, yeah, definitely more collectivist, less hierarchical.
Yes. Yeah.
So, you know,
On the spectrum, it's in a different spot.
on the spectrum. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in the cross-cultural traits, that power distance would be quite low.
Right.
Right.
Power
Yeah.
distance would be quite low.
Yeah.
Uncertainty avoidance as well would be quite low. So
Yeah.
quite a lot
Yeah.
of risk taking.
There's more risk taken. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes
Yeah.
sense. That makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
We've got also a comment from Lynn Murphy, and she
Yeah.
says,
Great comment.
yeah, Irish and Japanese cultures both being high context is one similarity.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you, Lynn. That's a good. That's a
Eh,
good.
yeah, that's great. And it reminds me when I first went to London, and this is a cultural point too, in terms of our awareness, despite having grown up in Belfast and people saying, "Where are you from?" Where are you from? Yeah. And I'd say, Belfast. I say, no, you're not. Because my
No,
accent
you're not.
was different to theirs. But when I first went to London, I was asking for directions. And this was a time when the IRA were still planting bombs. And
Right.
this old biker jacket and, you know, scruffy old 501s. And he said, "Excuse me, missus, where's Notting Hill Gate?" And that's, I'll just translate. "Excuse me, madam, where is Notting Hill Gate?" Yeah. And the reaction was, "Ah!" So this was very useful in terms of lowering the context, to Lynn's point. And thanks very much for that, Lynn. Lynn up there in Matsue, is it? Anyway,
Yeah.
Our Celtic sister.
lowering the context and finding that common ground, which put me in great stead, in terms of when I came back after that initial 5 years, came back to Europe. I based myself in London and spent essentially the time until the Asian currency crisis was really grinding me. I was here. I was in a strongest currency zone in Europe, in the advent of the euro. All of the European currencies were relatively depressed, and this ability to I guess shift the context and do it with my clients in a way that recognize both contexts.
Right.
Yeah. Didn't ignore them, but we find a way of we find a context that we can both understand and agree upon. And in terms of being able to run projects with clients that way, that proved quite effective, until the Asian currency crisis hit. And that was also a fabulous opportunity for me, in that it taught me a lot more about negotiation, about taking a haircut, as you say in America, Tim, reducing my own prices. And in order to reduce my own prices, I needed to reduce my costs, and this meant negotiating across my own supply chain, etc., etc. And finally, when the Asian currency crisis was having a quite a devastating effect, an exciting but devastating effect, I got headhunted into Nikkei 50, multinational corporation. And very soon after I was in there, and I was, I think I was facilitating a middle management meeting at the time. The CEO tapped me on the shoulder. He said, "I like the way you do things. Yeah, I like your style." A Japanese guy from Osaka, and Asada-san was his name. And he said, "I've got a project I'd like you to help me with." And I said, "But you're the CFO, and I'm not particularly numerate. And I think you've also seen my spreadsheets." And he said, "Don't worry, we'll help you with that." And so he had proposed that I support him with a particular program. And in order to do so, I requested that I conduct a few hearings and see, take the pulse really of people across Europe and also in Japan. And so a common theme that I heard from people when I spoke about this cost reduction program was that people were very, very concerned about job security.
Yeah.
And getting back to this unmet needs, they weren't really hearing this concern being mirrored so much. They weren't really hearing empathy in the organization itself. So what I did was went to Frankfurt to speak to the COO, a German guy, a bit of a legend in the industry, and made a proposal to him. And he said, "Are you crazy?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so."
Good answer.
Yeah. He said, "Speak to Asada." So Asada was the CFO.
Right.
And Reinhardt was the COO. And so I went to Asada-san and I made the same proposal to him, and he said, "Ahoko omae." I said,
さすが大阪の人だね。
Yeah.
そうです。じゃあやってみろ。Yeah. And that controversial thing was essentially being able to meet people on their same level, the same place where they were.
Right, meet them there.
By promising that as long as I was in charge of this cost reduction program, I would guarantee that headcount reduction, which is the laziest form and most counterproductive form of cost reduction.
I completely agree. Yeah.
Out there.
Anybody can do that.
Yeah.
It takes no skill.
So I made this brand promise, if you like, for the program that that would be out of scope. Nobody would be allowed to report headcount reduction as part of this program.
Yeah.
Because it would be counterproductive. The whole idea of the program was to empower people to identify waste and redundancies around them.
Right.
In order to streamline the operations.
Yeah, the only way that works is if you drive fear out of the organization and people are not afraid. Like
fear out of
that's the core. That's Deming. That's
voila. Yeah. That's it exactly. Yeah. And that really, really resonated with the organization. And with the people. We were tremendously successful as a result. Yeah. I wasn't doing any. I was just having conversations with people, and what really helped was that I also was emceeing the top management conferences within the organization. So I had the ears of all the heads of 40-something business units in Europe, and helping them with their presentations as well when they were presenting at the conference. If they were Japanese, helping them with the cross-cultural stuff, and vice versa for non-Japanese managers. Yeah, and giving them some insights into what was most current within Osaka headquarters, etc., etc. Anyway, so my main takeaway from that, and what I use in my practice as a leadership and team coach, and one particularly interested in change leadership, and this is something that I went on to study at business school, was that agency is everything. This sense of agency. Yeah. That you're not just telling people what to do.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Because we are born perfect. We are born brilliant. Yeah. And for the first few years of our life, we are fabulous. We can do anything. We're superhuman.
We're absorbing data.
Yeah. And we're encouraged to talk and to stand up and walk, talk. Wow, wonderful. And next we go into the education system and we're told to sit down and shut up.
Yeah. Be a factory worker, an obedient factory worker.
Yeah. So it's giving people back the agency. Creating psychological security. And typically in an engagement with clients, this will include a confidential conversation with the people who are going to be involved in whatever the process is. Typically, it's a 2-day workshop. I'll have a 30-minute conversation on Zoom or Teams or whatever platform they use. And as in all of my engagements, if, for example, the sponsor of the intervention wants to know who said what and when and why, I'll just say, you're not having that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that has to remain confidential.
That's confidential. Yeah. And
otherwise, you lose their trust, and then it's
exactly. Yeah. And just like I had with that cost reduction program, which incidentally was called Cost Busters. Who are you going to call?
Yeah.
Really, the psychological safety, knowing that you're going into a space and creating that space and holding that space for the participants, where there is no hierarchy, where all voices are encouraged and heard, and done so in an atmosphere of non-judgment. So there's none of this, oh, we've tried that before, it didn't work.
Yeah.
Not allowed that.
It's so funny. So I worked in the manufacturing field, and I think it's different in the context of a factory where, again, a lot of these concepts were from Deming, but they still fit with the overall, they weren't clashing with Japanese culture, right?
Yeah.
And so as a consultant, we would go into these companies. They were Japanese companies in the US, run mostly by Japanese, but there were American managers as well.
Yeah.
And we would do these Kaizen exercises. And my Japanese boss, he's like, okay, first of all, there's going to be resistance. So he's thinking strategically. One, we're outsiders. And two, if we go in there and tell people what to do, they're not going to do it.
Yeah.
So our role is not to boss them around. We are teachers.
Yeah.
And we're all, not me, but they trained me to think like one. We're the industrial engineer expertise. Our job is to train people from the floor to think like industrial engineers. And we just teach them the basics. They collected all the data. We brainstormed, we used their ideas, we helped them prioritize, but in the end, they owned it because, we were the teachers and the resources, and it was so effective. There's always resistance to change.
Yeah.
But if it's their idea to change, there's a lot less resistance, you know? So
Exactly.
I was very fortunate to grow up in that world where it became common sense, you know? So it really resonates.
Yeah. So we've got this concept of resistance as, I guess we've given it a negative connotation within our paradigm, because it's seen as something which is inefficient.
Or something to defeat.
However, does inefficient necessarily mean ineffective?
Right. Well, that's the
Because-
Japanese. They're effective, but they're not necessarily efficient. At least in my world that I came up in. Yeah. Sometimes,
And resistance is a wonderful gift.
I've never looked at it that way.
Yeah. It's a wonderful gift, because we're really getting to the hana, to the real authentic voice within people. And whenever there's resistance to a change, there are valid reasons for that resistance. And it means that the actual change and its ramifications and, how it's going to filter down through the organization has not been properly communicated. Has not been properly bought into, of course, yet.
People don't want change imposed on them.
Yeah.
But if it's their idea, they're happy to do it. You know,
Yeah.
and that's kind of how I framed it. But
yeah.
Interesting.
To quote from Ken, what was his family name? The guy who wrote "Who Stole My Cheese"?
I know the book, but
change that is imposed will be opposed. I'm paraphrasing here. Yeah.
It's all here. Yeah. And that I think what you're talking about in a different way is the idea of strategy. Like communication is about strategy. And I always quote Edward T. Hall. And he says this about in his definition of cross-cultural communication, but I think it's true with any communication. It's not about sending the right message. It's about getting a desired response, which implies strategy. How do you craft your message to get the desired response? And it seems like that's what your business is in a sense, or the big part of your approach.
You get the people to craft the message.
All right. Yeah. So Joseph helps us, maybe Ken Blanchard. It looks like a French name to me, or Blanchard.
The guy
Ken Blanchard. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
And by the way, we need a quick definition of high context for Joseph Murphy.
Yeah.
Okay. High context is essentially the less diverse societies in the world tend to be high context, because there's not so much contact with other parts of the world. So for Mr. Murphy, an example of that might be Belfast during the Troubles, when there wasn't a lot of investment in the city. There weren't a lot of people coming. They didn't want to get shot or blown up. And so we didn't get that much exposure to what was going on in the rest of Europe and the world. Yeah. And the result of that was that things were quite high context, and could initially have caused some difficulties for people communicating outside of their little bubble.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It's a guy, a longtime resident of Japan. He no longer lives here. Once said, I thought it was very profound, and it captures context here. He said, anything you can say about the Japanese, you can also say the opposite. And that it's just, they can be very indirect in the right context, but they can be brutally direct in a different context. You
Yeah,
know?
which
Everything is context.
which gets to the salient point of this, is that essentially culture is a myth.
All our symbols are myths in a sense. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Patterns
Culture
of behavior.
is a myth in that this world at any one particular time has at least 8 billion different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
The idioculture, the
Idioculture.
individual. That's what I call it, the idioculture. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's all how you define it,
Yeah.
and how you frame it.
Especially these days, we see culture, the fluidity of culture, the fluidity of identity. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when we try to define people too rigidly, then and say, oh, this is my definition, I'm this, and how dare you call me something else?
Yeah. That's one of my pet peeves.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like we're going in the wrong direction, and we're creating more labels when we should be reducing our labels. And to me, the ideal label is the individual's name. Like, let's take each person, and why put yourself in a box by saying I'm this label? Like, I don't understand it, but maybe that's too radical.
Yeah.
Well, I mostly identify as human.
Exactly. That's so good. That's it. We're human. We are human, and we're all a little bit different, or a lot different. It's just we're all over. Yeah, yeah.
And it's a wonderful thing. Yeah.
It's beautiful. I love it. Well, I know we're running out of time. Damn, we could keep this conversation going. So we got to have.
There's at least 30 minutes.
You know, we could have you back. You know, if you want
to. So in order to cross cultures effectively, we recognize culture, we celebrate it, and we don't let it become a self-limiting belief.
Yeah, that's the most important thing. I mean,
and it's easier to do that if you go live in another country.
Mm-hmm.
You
it helps
don't even
you
know you're limiting yourself unless you leave your pond. Right?
Indeed.
Don't let it be a self-limiting belief.
Yeah, that's a really good.
Listen out for the steam trains.
Yes, the steam trains. Yes, indeed. Okay. Well, thank you so much, really.
Yeah, thank you. That was fun. I enjoyed hearing your story.
That was fun. Thank you.
The stories you shared with us today, and I would love to continue the conversation in the future, if your schedule allows you, of course.
Sure.
And yes, so once again, yes, celebrate culture, but do not allow it to become your limiting belief. I think this is a great way to actually close today's episode. And say thank you to everybody who stayed with us, Lynn and also Joseph. Thanks a lot for listening in. Tove, thank you very much for tuning in as well. It was a pleasure to have you all with us on this Wednesday morning. Hopefully you do not suffer from kafunsho or any allergies to the yellow dust-like scent that comes from the west. And happy new midweek to everybody. We are looking forward to having you with us once again. Maybe this week on Sunday or next week on Wednesday once again. That's all. Thanks a lot. And this is a shout out to our sponsors. Thanks a lot to them as well.